What's up, guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I am talking to a professional Magic the Gathering player, and not just any Magic Pro. This guy has been a terror on Magic Online since he was a little kid. He turned pro in 2018, and since then, he has racked up a historic career to rival the likes of the great Kai Budde. They're often mentioned in the same sentence. He has 3 Pro Tour top 8s, including 2 wins. He's also the 2022 Magic the Gathering World Champion. It is my pleasure today to welcome Nathan Steuer to the channel. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Brian. Thanks so much for hosting.
I am so pumped to chat with you today, actually. We met roughly a month ago, I think, in Vegas. Although your reputation preceded you, I'd certainly heard about your success. And when I saw that you had signed up at sort of the last second for this crazy event that I was running in Vegas, I was beyond excited. What an honor to have a world champion show up to play in the event. And you actually did that right before you actually had to compete at a Pro Tour itself. How did you learn about that event anyway? How did it land on your radar, and what inspired you to put up $5K to register?
So initially my little internet search happened because it got posted on a Facebook forum somewhere that I saw, and then I'd kind of forgot about it over the course of a few weeks. I was in the testing house, actually, when I got a message from one of my good buddies, sounds like a mutual friend of ours, Tom Martell. Yep. And initially, when I heard of this, I was like, well, I love Vintage Cube. In my spare time, I do that for fun and drafting with LSV and other top players. And so the idea of getting to compete at a high level for potentially awesome anti-prizes and getting to be a part of this event was super exciting. My first move was like, how can I get in this? Is this still available?
Yeah.
Within like the first 5 minutes after hearing it was happening.
And in terms of, was there any hesitation at all about putting up the 5K entry fee? I know that, just speaking from experience, when I was a Magic Pro, and you have objectively substantially more success than I had as a pro, and the prizes are much higher. But to me, the idea of putting up $5,000 as an entry fee would have been too intimidating. You know, just considering all the variance in RNG, was that a point of hesitation?
Mildly so. I mean, 5K is a lot of money for me. One thing that was on my top of mind was just the idea that hopefully a lot of my Magic skills will translate, and I'll be able to at least make back that initial money. Based on how the event was set up, it was like, well, maybe there's some chance that it doesn't happen, but I believe in myself and my ability to succeed in these sort of high pressure settings. And so it was a great test to how I would perform leading up to the Pro Tour, at least to be able to compete even for a really high stakes event. Yeah,
it makes sense, actually, just as sort of a segue to get the blood flowing, right? Just to get in there and really compete on essentially a big stage, even though a totally unfamiliar card pool. We're gonna talk a lot more about the Cube a little bit later in the interview. I actually wanted to know how you got started as a player. Based on everything I've learned research-wise, you started when you were just 12 years old, 11, something like that. What was it like to kind of enter the game as a child, essentially?
I think I even started playing a bit younger than that, but it's hard to pin down the exact date. Like, funnily enough, so I grew up in California, and I have a twin brother. My twin brother, Jonah, and I were always really, really competitive, as you know, it happens when you're siblings with someone and you're both trying to figure out whatever the thing is that you're obsessed with. You know, initially we were really into sports and did a lot together. And at the same time, when we were at summer camp at some point, we had been playing with Pokemon cards, and one of the camp counselors comes over to us and he's like, hey, I have these new decks of cards. They're similar to Pokemon. Do you want me to teach you how to play?
How cool.
That was my initial intro into Magic, was a camp counselor who wanted to show us the game. And very quickly, my interest in it peaked, where I like saw what was going on and I understood some parts of it, but I didn't really know how I could do that with my friends. And so I roped, a whole bunch of us, I think 5 or 6 of us, and asked my mom and begged her. I was like, will you take us to the card store? My friends said that there's an event going on there and we could open packs there and play. So
how did that go? I mean, a lot of people, I think their path through Magic is really almost dictated by that very first formative experience. Did you win at the beginning? Was it fun? Was it frustrating? Were you befuddled by the rules? Or did you just sort of start kicking everyone's ass right out of the gate?
So the thing that was most enjoyable about it was we got there, and like the people working at this specific card store were so friendly and supportive to younger people who were playing in the store. that even when we saw, mostly adults, especially to us, maybe there was, some older teenagers or people who were there, it was a little bit intimidating, but everyone was so willing to help out that I think even from like the first night there, we left and we're like, okay, we want to go every week. Can we go? And so I don't actually really remember too many breaks in between starting playing Magic and continuing to go as often as I could.
How did your collection evolve? Because I can only kind of compare my own experience. And it's really interesting, just as an aside, you and I have so much in common with how the age that we were at, although actually that's not accurate. Some of the circumstances are similar. You were introduced to the game when you were a little bit younger than you said, around 10, 11, something like that. I couldn't have been introduced to it until I was a little bit older by nature of the fact that it literally didn't exist until I was, it landed on my radar in 1994 when I was just 19 years old. But the thing that you and I have in common is that we were both at UC Santa Cruz when we essentially dropped out of university, out of college to go and pursue Magic full time.
That's really cool. I had no idea. This is the first time I'm learning it now, but yeah, no, I would love to tell you a bit more about that as well.
Please tell me about it. I'm very curious to sort of see how you progress through those first few years, whether or not did you initially kind of latch onto it as something you wanted to excel at? Because I found that with other people that I've encountered, that people who kind of come into Magic and play it competitively very often had an extremely competitive background in something else prior to that. Whether it was competitive video games, whether it was competitive athletics, and for a lot of people, it was actually competitive chess. So I'm curious to know if you had any sort of thing that validated to you. I mean, at a certain point, you start to realize, wait a minute, I'm really, really good at this compared to the other people I play against. I'm winning all the time. I expect you might have been better than your brother right out of the gate. Did you have that kind of experience with something before Magic, or was Magic the first time when you suddenly kind of took notice that you had this aptitude?
So I think that I already knew by the point that I started Magic that I really liked high level strategy. Like beyond that, my favorite game was, you know what Strateggo is, that game?
Oh my God, we could share stories. Very much so. Yes, I've talked about it.
That was one of my favorite games to play with my brother and with friends. And then I loved playing cards. There was a variety of different card games just with playing cards that I would play with friends and family. Over time, I think that it became really clear. So my brother and I played a lot together. And for the first 3 or 4 years, we both had a lot of competitive aspirations. We wanted to be really good at the game, but it was a competition amongst us, right? When you have a twin and you're both really into the same hobby,
I imagine
you're like, I'm better than you. You're, going back and forth trying to prove it to the other person.
What did that look like? Yeah. What did that look like in terms of the rivalry?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, my brother and I have always been like quite close. And so even though we were kind of rivals trying to be better than each other, I think over time, as I got more and more invested in it and got better at playing Magic, people at the store knew me as that kid who's, 3-0ing a lot of the drafts and doing well. My brother started to integrate more into like the social scene when we got to middle school and kind of shift his attention to other things.
Interesting.
And so I think by that point in time, we went to our first GP together and traveled around 12 and
12 years old.
Yeah, I think so.
That's right. I remember reading the history, right? That you made history, I think, as the youngest person to day 2 at Grand Prix when you were 12 years old.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think at the time it was certainly like a really cool accomplishment. Like when I beat Reed Duke on day 2 of my first GP, they wrote like an article about it. And that was extra motivation to be like, okay, cool. Like I can do this. And now people are like starting to recognize me as like a younger prodigy of some kind, and that part was really cool. But for me, it was mostly like, okay, I want to qualify for a pro tour. Like I want to go to the events on the weekends. My brother, by that point, was starting to waver his interest in playing a ton of competitive Magic. And so I would go with, my friends who were 10 years older than me regularly to different tournaments and travel.
It reminds me a little bit of Bobby Fischer's story, I think, how Bobby Fischer was this prodigy chess player. As soon as he discovered the game, it was just all he wanted to do and what he knew he was destined to do it. But being so young, he needed mentors and stuff who kind of would take him from event to event. So he would get on a plane when he was a little kid and fly somewhere with some Russian guy out to some international tournament. So did you have it was a similar experience like that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few close friends. My buddy Lee is someone from the Bay Area that I went to with a lot of tournaments, and he sort of mentored me and helped make sure I could get cards for events, which I'm always really eternally grateful for, and still a close friend of mine today. A few stories that actually came up from what you were saying. So I have two in mind. The first, so when I was in high school, there was a team GP that was coming up, and this one I believe was GP Detroit. And at this GP, I had made arrangements to team with two of my friends, but I didn't have a lot of money. And so I basically would have to figure out how to pay for flights using magic money that I accumulated on the weekends. And I made this commitment to go to the tournament. Meanwhile, when I ran it past my parents, they told me, no, like, you can't go to this event. Sorry, it's a Jewish holiday. You can't go to this event. We have plans, and sorry. I came up with a whole scheme where I figured out how to basically convince one of the teachers at the school that I was going to leave early for an appointment, and then text my dad that I was going to be back late because I only had to be there on Sunday for the, commitment that I had. Yeah. So I was like, okay, I'm going out of town for an event on Saturday, about an hour away. I'm going to stay at a friend's house, and then I'll be back on Sunday, knowing fully well that I was going to have to make up an excuse for why I couldn't be there on Sunday. And so I actually got on the flight, made it to Detroit, and played the event. Obviously, my parents found out much earlier than I intended. I was boarding my gate to leave San Francisco when I got angry calls and proceeded to go anyways. But,
oh my God, how old were you at the time?
I think I was either 15 or 16. But,
so amazing.
But that was one distinct memory of I just knew I can't let my team down beyond my own interest in going. It was like, well, I made this commitment. Sorry, I'm going to go. I'll face the consequences later.
How'd you end up doing? Did you make Sunday?
Horrible.
Horrible.
But it was still an awesome weekend. And I'm sure, even my dad now at the time looks back at this this is hilarious. It's a good story. So
what was the second story?
And then the second story is a little more heartfelt. But growing up, I went to events with, like I said, my friend Lee, and then two of my other buddies. Their names are Mike and Joe. And Mike and Joe and I played almost every weekend. We'd go to RCQs and PPTQs and PTQs when those were a thing a few years prior. And essentially, I'd gotten one or so wins away from the Pro Tour on 4 occasions at that point. I'd gone 12-3 in some GPs.
Wow. And
been really, really close. At some point, I was 12-1 at a GP and was the only person that couldn't draw into top 8. So close.
12-1, you could not draw.
Yeah.
That's utterly insane to me. How big was the field? Like thousands?
This was GP San Jose when I was, 15 or 16 as well, in that range. Probably, I don't know, I have to double check, 2,000 people. But to break down what that means, basically these Grand Prix events, they have 15 rounds. And in order to make the Pro Tour, you have to go typically either 12-2-1, 12 wins, 2 losses, and 1 draw.
Yeah.
Or, you can be 12 wins, 1 loss, and 2 draws, and you're into the final rounds. And then in larger sizes, you have to win 13 of your 15 rounds. So that was my first heartbreaking moment. But after this happened, there was one season where Wizards decided to run these team regional championship qualifiers, where basically the winners of these 3-person trio events would qualify for the Pro Tour, which was Pro Tour 25th anniversary. And this is actually how I qualified for my first Pro Tour. Was 2 of my best friends in the world, and I got to play in this team event and qualified together, just barely eking out the last win in the top 4 of the event. And that was like a dream come true for me after having so many close near miss events.
What did you guys finish in that one in order to... Was
in
there
the
even,
actual Pro Tour?
No, I'm talking about in the team event, in the qualifier. In terms of just record, I'm curious to know what the structure was like to get you. Was there a Final Four playoff or something? I'm not sure what team play is like, was like at this point in time. This is like 2017, 18, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I actually don't fully remember, but I know that this was like a regional qualifier that everyone in the Bay Area, and there's a lot of really good players in that area. And I knew everyone by name and face just by competing there for such a long time. But those guys all played. And so there's about 75 teams or so competing, and the top 4 teams get the invite to the Pro Tour.
Got it. Okay.
So really, really cool event leading up to that. But yeah, I would say like my Pro Tour journey was a really big part of this experience where I was like constantly, looking towards how can I achieve this goal? And over the course of several years, seeing some consistent improvement motivated me to continue doing that.
It's such a kind of astonishing story in its totality, not just because of all the things that aligned along the way to get you to where you are, but just on the subject of coincidences and symmetries with me, honestly. Mm-hmm. It's bizarre. I grew up in the Bay Area also. I played Magic in the Bay Area and competed in that entire area back in the arena in the 1990s. I went to UC Santa Cruz. I'm also Jewish like you. And to go back to something you said before, a game that I played a ton as a kid with my brother was Strateggo also. I've talked about it on the channel. Did you and your brother ever modify the game? Did you guys ever change the rules of Strateggo, or did you just play the regular version of it all the time?
To be honest, I have no clue at this point, but very well could have. I know that we spent so much time playing a variety of different games together that that was, when you have a twin, like that really was like my best friend too, right? We spent so much time playing different games and having that experience together. It was great. Yeah.
One of the things that we did was we played a random version of it. So you'd take all the pieces and you'd just gather them in your shirt, and just starting in the upper left-hand corner, you just place them randomly across the board. So you'd have the same structure, and every now and then you have to contend with what do you do when your flag is on the front line? Is there a way to protect it?
No.
Yeah. Or sometimes one of your key pieces gets walled off behind a line of bombs or something on the back row. But it just introduced a whole bunch of variance into the game. We also made a bunch of unique pieces too. So we took a little piece of paper and stuck it on the back. And it just from a balance perspective.
Expansion.
Yeah, we made our own expansion. Exactly. One of my favorite pieces was a piece that we called it the Briber. So it had the same frailty as the Spy, basically. It could get killed by anything. But its attack was to flip an adjacent enemy piece around. So that's how so if you came near it, it would flip your guy around. You had to be very careful about it. We had a walking bomb. We had a guy with a suicide vest that would blow himself up and could just kill everything adjacent, friend or foe.
That's awesome.
And it's interesting because I suspect that had you been born in a different, like I'm Gen X, I'm 51, and I guess you're 23.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we're separated by a huge gulf of time, 28 years, multiple generations and stuff. And in my growing up as a kid, I was much more attracted to games that felt kind of more open-ended, that I had some agency in how the game played out. And I often modified the rules and stuff. It's something that kind of led me to a career in game design. And it's one of the things that really made Magic resonate with me as well, because this was a game system that was completely open-ended. The intention was, we're going to show you the basic framework of the rules, but you're going to figure out and define what version of this game do you really want to play. And I'm kind of curious to know, a lot of people are defined by Mark Rosewater's ideas of psychographics, which I'm sure you're familiar with. What are Nathan Steuer's psychographics? How do you approach Magic as both a problem solver and also as a strategist?
Yeah, I mean, using the traditional monikers that like Mark uses, I would obviously describe myself as like a spike, right? In terms of the competitiveness and the drive. But to be a bit more granular than that, I would say I really value like when I'm playing Magic, I think the way that I express myself within it is this ability to tinker around and explore new ideas by essentially trying to figure out different adjustments in a shell. And so I view Magic as like this game where you have all these components and your goal is not only to figure out how they interact with one another, which you do through, testing and practicing for events.
Yeah.
You also need to try to derive like a top-down perspective of how do I, as a player, get to adjust information outside of a game to make a decision that impacts it 100 games from now. So like to give you an example of that, when I go to a Pro Tour team, my role on the team is not just to be like a really strong technical player. I would say one of my biggest strengths is that if you give me a situation where I'm playing and I've played 5 or so games, I could usually tell you out of those 5 games or so, maybe 10 on like a more complex problem, a rough estimate of how this will play out over a larger sample size and my perspective on like, how do you have to adjust this? Because there's a key component here that others might not have valued as highly or in the same way as mine. So I view myself as like a problem solver, really. Like I try to figure out what are the core problems and constraints. How can I use my brain power in order to identify those? And then not only introduce like efficiency, but also a strategy so that each of the members can utilize like their strengths. To give like one more comparison, one game I've gotten into over the past handful of years is poker. And one of the parallels, poker obviously has so many parallels between Magic. But one of the components that I've really taken from my Magic prowess is you need to be able to read what your opponent is doing. And poker's less, people kind of think of it as the like, oh, you could look at someone and be like, are you bluffing or not? I don't really see it that way. Sometimes maybe that's the case. I more so think through, okay, they're making decisions on each of these decision trees. How are they reducing the likelihood that they have a set of cards? And so when I talk about it to people and I coach them in Magic, I'm like, we're hand reading the opponents, but really what you're doing is you're making sets of logical inferences. And my goal is to help you make these inferences that you already have, but you don't know how to prompt yourself with. Like the question asking aspect of Magic is one that I find fascinating. And I try to like push people to ask them those questions so that they can naturally start coming up with them, on their own without needing someone to prod them. So yeah, just a few thoughts there. I know I kind of word vomited some of this, but hopefully that makes sense. No,
I'm following it. It makes perfect sense, actually. And I'm wondering, just hearing you describe that, it makes you sound like you're very, very suitable to be a teacher and a mentor as a Magic player. Have you actually taught the game to people in the past? Just completely from scratch?
For the past few years, I've done a handful of different coaching curriculums that I've ran, and my job was one-on-one coaching, but these are for people who are a little more established in Magic. From like a first principles approach of you haven't touched the game and you want to learn. I've dabbled and taught some people, but I think really where I get to showcase like my joy for the game and helping people is breaking through like that first or second big wall when they're trying to think about it. And I'm asking myself, if I had someone like at the same level of playing the game and thinking about the game as I am right now, how would I have taught my younger self to perform basically at a higher level quickly? Like most of these folks want to learn. When you're teaching someone math, you don't really understand how to solve a problem until you can solve another 500 of the same problem. And by that, I mean, like, for me at least, I can do math once I understand a concept really well, in perpetuity, basically. I can do that problem or similar adjacent problems. But until I understand it, I might as well be like, twiddling my thumbs. Like, it's not going to help me if someone just explains it to me without me understanding that baseline framework.
Yeah, that's, I guess, the sort of the gold standard of understanding, really, as defined by a lot of people. I'm a big fan of Richard Feynman's definition of that. Mm-hmm. And I expect you've probably read his definition as well. But just the idea that if you can disseminate something, if you can break it down to its constituent parts and get a 6-year-old child to understand it on some level, then you fully understand it enough yourself that you, and whether or not that understanding actually can be improved upon. I'm very curious about this, because back when I was playing the game professionally, Magic was uncharted territory. The internet didn't really exist in anything close to its modern form. You've probably read about the Usenet in the past, but I doubt that you've actually used the Usenet because it kind of went the way of the dodo in the mid 1990s, long before you were actually born. But even finding information on the Usenet in the 1990s was a real challenge, much less parsing it and understanding whether what you were reading was accurate or just a reflection of some weird provincial rule, some strange house rule that had warped the meta of a place you're visiting. I remember showing up at this event in just north of the Bay, actually. I think it was in Reading. It might have
been to my fair share of tournaments there. Yeah.
There was a place there called the Copa Cafe, and I imagine it's probably long gone. But I walked into the Copa Cafe with some friends of mine in probably 1995, pre-Ice Age for sure. But we definitely had access to Mana Drain. There was this kind of interesting lull between when Legends was printed and the run-up all the way up to the release of Ice Age, which of course introduced Necropotence into the fray. But prior to that, control decks were just so unbelievably dominant. If you knew how to play control well, there was really nothing that anyone could do against it strategically, short of just getting lucky. There was no way to metagame against it, and nothing could really beat this deck. So I and all my friends played versions of control. And I walk into this place, the Copa Cafe, where they are contesting, I think the prize was an Alpha Mox Pearl or something. They had crazy prizes at this place because you could get them for a couple $100 at the time. And there's a sign on the wall that says you are not allowed to channel Fireball, kill your opponent before the third turn of the game. And I go, well, that's really weird. What a strange rule, right? Like, I've been killed by channel Fireball maybe 2 or 3 times in my life because, yeah, it's got all of this sort of vaunted history and people talk about it like it was this thing that happened all the time. But anyone who understands probability knows that the chances of actually doing that consistently are almost nil. A couple of percent. You could go weeks without actually successfully doing it before your opponent hits you with a Black Knight or something, and now you're below them in life.
Yep.
It turned out that the entire metagame of this place had been warped by its thought leader, by its alpha player, a guy whose name was Sin, S-I-N. And Sin was this tatted up dude in his mid-20s that played out sleeveless on these nasty ass sticky tables at the bar, because the Copa Cafe had a cafe and then it had a bar in the back, which is where the tournament actually was. But Sin was so much better than everybody else that he kind of dictated the metagame, and he put channel in every deck he played. So everybody at this event, no matter what their strategy was, if they were playing land destruction, they're playing control or aggro, or even white weenie, were all running the combo in their deck because Sin had sort of, again, this is the 1990s. There isn't free information flow on the internet. So you get these weird inbreeding things going on. In fact, I don't know if have you read any of the books written by Patrick Chapin on Magic theory at all?
No, I haven't read them, but I'm familiar with a handful of the concepts and just the general frameworks in it. Yeah. Yeah.
He actually is in the very final stages of finalizing another book. And he spoke extremely highly of you. Actually, we talked about you quite a bit, both before the event and certainly afterward, due to the controversy that we'll touch on a little bit later, Time Elemental Gate. But Chapin talked about this idea in his book about army ants. He told a story of giant colonies of ants that erupt from the ground in the Amazon and march in one direction where their pheromone scent has alerted them to a nearby ant colony to conquer and enslave. And you get this carpet of 20 million, 30 million, 50 million ants moving as one unit across the ground. And they follow the ant in front of them. They actually have no navigation. They live in a 2-dimensional world, and their entire world is just the pheromone trail in front of them. It's actually something that Feynman himself talked about too. Oh, wow. And every now and then, for whatever reason, and ant biologists have not made this determination, the ants glitch. And instead of walking in a straight line, they begin to turn in a circle. They follow the ant in front of them, and the whole column begins to turn in an arc, a gentle arc that sweeps all the way around and eventually rewinds around itself. And pretty soon, this gigantic mass of ants, a huge amount of the colony, is now moving in this weird coiling maelstrom, and they get stuck like this potentially for days and days until the entire colony drops dead from exhaustion. And he tells this story as an analogy for the way that Magic communities evolved back in the day. that you would get this army ants effect where a thought leader like Sin would show up and he would just sort of guide the metagame. And it's such a huge generational difference between how I grew up playing the game and you. I'm wondering, is there space still for thought leadership in modern Magic? Is that a thing where there are authority figures who even the other pros sort of are deferential to? Or is everyone just so good and so informed now that there's no real room for that? I'm very curious.
So it's interesting because the shape of what you described has some parallels like to what current Magic looks like. But it's going to be way less drastic in terms of what it looks like from the outside. Take this last Pro Tour, for example.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about it.
So leading up to the Pro Tour, deck specific things, there's 3 different archetypes of decks. There's these landfall decks, right? They kind of operate in this mid-range zone where they can grind really hard or they can combo kill you out of nowhere. Remember, like every deck now has some element of unfairness in it, usually. Something intrinsic. And this is standard. This isn't, vintage, legacy, modern. No, these are like standard decks that have this element in them. And then you look at the decks, the other parts of the format. You have these blue-red decks, and basically all of them can be described as some mix between cantrip decks that grind, cantrip decks that try to kill you, or some mishmash of cantrip decks, but that's their identity. They're going to find the key cards and they're going to try to, like a Delver deck in Legacy, go through their library at a fast enough clip that their hand is stacked versus your hand that didn't have as much card selection.
Right.
And then lastly, there's a few other decks in the metagame that fill in holes. They can take the shape of different strategies that are doing something broken, but sort of one-tracked. And going into this Pro Tour, my job was, I worked very closely with another pro player, Javier Dominguez. And Javier has been an incredible Magic player for much of his career. He's won 2 world championships. And my experience working with Javier has been awesome because I started working with him during COVID at some point. And at this point, we only knew each other online. But when paper play resumed, one of the first Pro Tours I got to work really closely with him for was Pro Tour March of the Machines, which was the other Pro Tour that I won before this past weekend, a few weeks ago. And one thing that Javier does differently than most of these people, similar to what you described as like a thought leader, is he looks at decks and he says, what are the cards here that other people think are untouchable or necessary that are just not, that we've kind of decided are essential pieces of a strategy. And for this event, that was, and not just for this event, but just in general, people don't like to be challenged along this axis very often. I
agree.
One of the reasons that I can see for this is that you're basically saying that thousands of other people are wrong, right? When you do that, that makes people uncomfortable because they have to, on some level, defer to you or put their trust in you over this other group of people who are presumably well informed by having a ton of folks working on the same thing. So back to what happened with this Pro Tour, though, but Javier identified that there was this one card, Ice Till Explorer, that every deck ubiquitously included 4 of in the landfall strategy. What does it do mechanically? Sure. Ice Till Explorer costs 4 mana. It's 2 green for a 2/4 creature. And it has an ability that says you might play an additional land every turn. And whenever a land enters the battlefield, you mill a card. That's the entire card. So when you're thinking about how this card fits into a standard deck, you'd be like, oh, well, this seems kind of good, but cards are pretty pushed these days. Specifically, what Ice Till Explorer does really well is you start milling cards from your graveyard, or rather to your graveyard, and then you get to find cards with flashback, or you get to put up to 4 landfall triggers in play a turn because you played a fetch land from your graveyard. I see. And so within 2 turns, you've fetched, 4 or so basics from your deck. Your deck is thinned. You've gotten this card advantage by virtue of playing lands from your graveyard.
How are you? How are you? Does the creature, do you have a Crucible
Apologies.
Worlds effect or something? Yeah, I'm curious to know how that's going on.
I missed the mark on this one. It also says you may play lands from your graveyard. That's the other key part of the card.
That makes him a little better. Yeah, for sure.
Big part of the card.
Yeah.
But anyways, so this card has multiple abilities going on. And he basically said, look, guys, we know this card is strong, but I have a hunch that maybe we could build it with less of this card. Let's start by playing 0, and then if we need to work our way back up, we can. And so whenever I hear him have these ideas, I try to give them a real chance. And one of the ways I love doing this is I'll be, in the villain seat playing against people and being like, okay, I'm going to play the best Magic I can. You throw this build at me and let's see what is going on in the games, if this is making sense. And that's like a quick litmus test for it.
Got it.
So that's like one way in which I find, like, even at a top level, there's a lot of room for like these thought leaders. And ultimately we had the best deck for the tournament, and the finals was me versus one of my teammates playing the same deck, Chris Larson.
How many of the 2-4 did you ultimately wind up running?
We ended up playing 2.
2 of them was the right number, and not 4 because it seemed mandatory. I mean, it is a 4-drop. I don't know obviously enough about the format and how fast it was. And I did want to reiterate that the tournament, because someone might watch this video 6 months from now, the event that you won recently was Pro Tour Strixhaven, right? In Vegas.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So like one of the other things though, within this all, just one more tidbit on like testing notes and something cool that happened there. But I really love this idea that, I don't know where it got started. It might have been me. It might have been Javier, but it was in one of the testing sessions back in 2023 or so. And this idea came that, okay, what can we do in order to make testing more efficient and to get more information on cards that no one wants to put in their deck? And from a game design perspective, I'm sure you'll love this, but what we did and what we've been doing going forward is we'll take cards and we'll make essentially split cards where if you draw, let's say you have, a 4 of in your deck, you can turn one of those 4 ofs or 2 of those 4 ofs into a split card. Where
which one do I want more right now?
We could do that with 3 different cards in one instance. And just that visualization aspect of having to compare the options on a little piece of paper that's within your card and trying it out. We'll even create broken split cards where you have, a Wrath of God effect where you can kill all the creatures, versus a 5-mana creature that, basically wins the game if it untaps. So really, really unfair split cards, but with the purpose being like, let's try to extract information here and look less at who wins or loses and more at like, how can we creatively problem solve with the limited resources that every team has. And, Magic is a game that requires a lot of creativity. I like the idea of how can you express creativity through redesigning the game engine when you're practicing for big tournaments.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's an incredibly cool innovation, and something that in the playtesting that I did years and years and years ago for the Emergent Pro Tour, that's not something that we ever did. It was always, the archetypes were always completely isolated. And the amount of navigation that you could do to really figure out exactly what you're saying, a card that seems like it's part of the orthodoxy and an obvious 4 of, what actually happens if we do cut this down to 0 or 1 or 2 and so on. There's so much of that went on back then because, again, of thought leadership and the fact that people would just generally defer to someone that was kind of leading the group. One final kind of piece that I had left behind, also related to Chapin's anecdote about the idea of army ants, is that what gets the maelstrom out of this churning situation, what rescues the colony, it's the idea of rogue ants, which are, for whatever reason, ants that are just programmed differently. And there's 1 in 100,000 ants is just programmed this way. Rather than marching in the column and following the ant in front of them, the rogue ant will just randomly veer off in a different direction. It'll reorient and taking its pheromone trail with it. And eventually another ant will follow that trail, and then 2 and then 4. And if everything goes according to plan, the colony will redirect and begin to walk in the correct direction again. That these rogue ants are necessary in order to prevent the army ant loop from going on. And in my experience, I've been playing the game and I've been steeped in Magic for over 30 years at this point, 32 years. And I've met thousands of people, thousands of really exceptional people through Magic. Watched my contemporaries kind of go on to dominate the world in all these different industries and areas. And the one consistent vein that seems to run through everybody is that, without exception, everybody is a rogue ant. That whether their skill, and everybody has a different version of that skill set. And you've already sort of defined the difference between you and Javier in terms of just the way that you approach it. Javier sounds more to me that he's more of kind of a creative rogue ant for innovating in ways that are novel. One of the people that's working on the game that I'm developing right now, a person you may or may not heard of, I'd actually be curious to know if you've heard of him, is Alan Comer. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of Alan?
I've heard of him. I'm not familiar with him personally, but I have heard of him as a fixture of Magic's past. Is he a Hall of Famer as well, or no?
He is a Hall of Famer, yeah, and very deservedly so. He was I think he's most credited with the creation of the deck called Miracle Grow. He was the first person to figure out how broken Quirion Dryad was back when, I think it was in Visions is when it got printed. And in fact, I remember at some Pro Tour, it might have been I think it was in 1996 or 1997, Alan just walks up to me when we're kind of milling around, either between rounds or before the event. It would have been between rounds, obviously, because the events kick off at 8 a.m. or something, or 9. But somewhere during the lunch break, Alan says, "Hey, Brian, do you want to play some Magic?" And I go, "Sure, man. I've got the deck here. I'll play you." And we sit down to play, and he's playing this weird Simic deck, blue-green, a deck that you would just immediately just discard or you would just dismiss it out of hand. Doesn't have any of the good control cards in it at all. It has none of the white cards that sort of dominate and define the meta at that time. And a few turns into the game, he plays this innocuous 1/1 creature, a Quirion Dryad. And I have a counterspell in my hand, or a Mana Drain. I do not have a Sword Splashers. I look at him like it's a 1/1, whatever. And the next turn, he hits me for 8 with it. And the next turn, he kills me with it. And I'm just like, oh my God, what just happened? It was such a weird sort of paradigm shattering thing. And Alan is an example of someone that is not just a thought leader, but a real true rogue ant. His way to sort of look at the game and make assessments about what was good were so alien to the way that I approached it. He and I were both innovators in Magic, but his innovation was on just a completely different level, like a completely different axis from mine.
Totally.
Yeah. Another fun, quick Alan anecdote was related to the famous Necro Summer in 1996, which I'm sure you've heard about.
Yeah.
When Ice Age had been out for long enough for people to really figure out Necro strategies. And at the beginning of 1996, when the Pro Tour launched, Leon Lindback very famously made, I think, top 4 at the first Pro Tour in New York. And then the junior division was won by a guy from Santa Barbara, a friend of mine named Graham Tatomer, also playing mono black Necro. And everyone's like, oh my God, this deck is totally nuts. Everyone starts playing it. And until people figured out Turbostasis, which took place at US Nationals like 5 or 6 months later, Necro was hyper dominant through that whole maybe 4 or 5 month period. If you played in a qualifier, you played Necro deck 6 rounds in a row, even more dominant than I guess the Izzet deck is in the current meta. So I remember seeing like a top 8 that said that like all top 8 decks, or all decks in the top 8 were Izzet decks in some standard event relatively recently.
Yeah, for the recent one last weekend, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it's just madness, right? And even more dominant than that. And so somewhere in there, we have a regional event actually held down. I think it was in Southern California. And I, of course, am playing mono black Necro. All my friends are playing mono black Necro. And during the event, I didn't actually know him at this time, but I hear this voice periodically off in the distance, somewhere on another table, because he's Scottish, I think, originally. So he speaks in this very sort of lilting, high-pitched Scottish accent. I would hear the same word over and over again, announced with glee. Cormusbell? It sounded like that. I would play Cormusbell. He would play this card called Cormusbell. Do you know what Cormusbell even does?
No, tell me.
It's so bad it's not in the old school cube.
Oh my gosh.
I have no idea. Honestly, I'll have to ask Richard next time I see him, the origins of Cormusbell. It's a 4-mana rare artifact from Alpha. And I have no idea what appeared in testing, but I think that the early testers of the game, I think, figured out that Black had something special going on. It just, between Spectre and Sinkhole and Black Knight and Mind Twist and stuff, Black just seemed too good. So they put Karma into the set to just absolutely destroy Black. And they put this artifact called Cormispell, but they might have actually made it as a way for black to close out games or something. It's living lands for swamps, basically, in artifact form. A totally bizarre card. Turns all swamps into 1/1 creatures.
Yeah.
But Alan was playing mono red with 4 copies of Cormispell in his deck. And he had 4 copies of Earthquake, 4 copies of Serrated Arrows, 4 copies of Pyroclasm, and Lightning Bolt and Disintegrate and Fireball. And it didn't really matter. He would just put out Cormispell, and like the mighty Necro deck was completely annihilated instantaneously from this artifact. A card that none of us had ever even considered for even 1 second to play with, much less as a threat. And it's so nasty that once you do the Cormispell Pyroclasm combo, they can't even activate a Nevinyrral's Disc because it requires them to play a swamp that's summoning sick for 1 turn. And you just keep killing the 1 swamp. And you'd walk over to Alan's table and he'd have 3 copies of Serrated Arrows in play. Do you know what that does?
Yeah, you can put a -1/-1 counter on a creature by tapping it. Yeah, you have
exactly.
3 activations.
The best card in Homelands, probably outside of maybe Merchant Scroll. And I guess Merchant Scroll is actually like legitimately the best card. But for the era, it was definitely the most influential card. And you'd have 3 copies of Serrated Arrows in play with like 2 counters and 3 and 3. And his opponent is sitting there with nothing out. Or maybe like a Nevinyrral's Disc just sitting there untapped while Alan just plays land after land. Anyway, Alan, consummate rogue ant player and carved out a very, very successful career for that. So it's very heartening for me to hear that there's still room for that, despite the fact that everybody kind of knows everything now. How long does it take, generally, in your experience, for between the spoiler release of a set and the solutions to appear? How long does that pipeline take?
So there are a lot of instances where like cards are spoiled these days and it's immediately apparent that they are doing something broken. And then there are times when the uptake on that information comes right after a Pro Tour or somewhere in between. I'll give you a few recent examples without going too in depth, but I'm sure you're familiar with Nadu Winged Wisdom and that card getting printed into Modern.
Because of Commander, it's actually something that I want to talk about a little bit later. But yes, very familiar with Nadu.
So when they print cards like Nadu, which are, creatures for 3 mana that essentially let you draw your deck and win the turn you play them, people are going to catch on. I remember I have some friends who were like, I initially figured out the combo. I put together the 2 obvious pieces with this card right after it was printed. And that's a situation where it's like, well, maybe the designers like missed this card, but pretty clear night and day, night as day that like this is something that people are going to figure out right away. Then there are other situations where there are cards in Standard now that like they kind of take a whole season. One card that I probably am the winningest player with, and I love this card, is Fable of the Mirror Breaker.
I run that in my Commander deck. Yeah, it's insane. The red enchantment that does like 5 things or whatever and eventually makes a Kiki-Jiki.
Does all the things. It makes a 2/2. That 2/2 makes treasures. It filters your hand on the second chapter. Then it turns into Kiki-Jiki on the backside. Yep. And when this card was first spoiled during COVID, this was in the Return to Kamigawa. And in that set, it was a really good limited card, which is always something to look for when you're considering things for Standard or other formats. How good is this card in Draft?
Right.
And in this case, it was really good there, but it took a full 2 Pro Tours. The first Pro Tour, people played it, and it was pretty broken in that deck. By the second Pro Tour that rolled around, people had almost forgotten about how broken this card was. And
crazy.
Again, it was the best card in Standard that everyone wanted to play, or should have been playing rather at this point. Then we go back to, this is in 2022 now, when I won Worlds. Did you know I was the only player to play Fable of the Mirror Breaker in a Grixis shell? Everyone else was playing Esper Midrange, and I'm the one player who's like, no, you guys should definitely be playing this card. It's as good as most of the cards in Modern right now. And that was where I got such a huge edge in this tournament. My advantage came from being one of the only players who put 4 Fable of the Mirror Breakers in my deck. What do
you think was the reason for that? I'm very curious. Was it something, did you test with Javier for that event as well?
No, we hadn't been on the team yet, acquainted yet, but I tested with a team called Team Handshake since 2021.
A very, very ironic name, considering what we'll talk about later, but come on.
And those guys are amazing. They were like a huge positive influence on like my Magic career overall. Still friends with a handful of those guys today. But when we were testing for this tournament, we knew that this Esper mid-range deck was really strong, and I had played a lot of this Grixis mid-range deck and was beating the Esper decks in practice. It was a classic case where people were expecting these other decks to appear that would prey on this Grixis mid-range deck. And if that were the case, it might be a bad pick. But since everyone wanted to play the Esper mid-range piles, I decided, well, I'm going to stick to my guns. And what I think makes the most sense here is this strategy that's really good into the most expected deck. So the metagame comes out and I see Grixis midrange, one deck, which is just me playing it. And 70% of the metagame, and it's a small field, there's 32 people in it, we're playing Esper midrange for the tournament. And so one of those cases where I think my advantage came partially from, being a good player at that point in time that can compete with the best. And otherwise, a large part of this was that I had the deck of the weekend and no one could really compete with this deck on the same, level. And the margins are going to be smaller than your experience playing in 1994 and 1995 because everyone knows this deck in some capacity. But there's still events these days that you play and you're like, wow, we kind of broke the tournament with our deck selection. And I don't think I'll ever play another tournament again where I'm the only player playing the broken deck in a tournament of elite players. So that was really cool.
Yeah, it's amazing. And to have that be in a world championship of all the events where that happens too, it's got to be just euphoric dream come true.
Oh yeah. That
Perfect,
was awesome.
Perfect call. Yeah, on the subject of that, actually, your reward, one of the rewards, obviously, besides the renown and the title and the pro points and the money, is the opportunity to design your own Magic card. I'd like to hear a little bit about the origins of the card that you submitted, including the name, stats, etc., for the for the audience.
So the card that I've designed, and just a sidebar, making my own card was so incredibly cool that I was like, I can't really imagine how many other ways, that I could express like my love for Magic than being on my own Magic card that people get to play with. And if you don't play Magic and you're like, oh, you have your own card, like that's still a very cool thing to be able to show my family and friends. But during the design of this card, there's a few interesting things. So I don't know how in depth I can go about the process, but what I can say about it is at Wizards of the Coast, it's a collaborative process with the winner at Worlds for how are you going to design the card to meet the different identities that you want to express from it.
Right.
And in this case, there was a few requirements that I had, so to speak, things that I really, really weighed heavily. And then a few things that were like, well, it'd be nice if this could happen. So the things that I talked with a few of the game designers about were Magic to me is really fun when you get to do things that are interactive and reward you for this sort of experience.
Totally.
I love when I get to have exchanges where some player ends up, 0.2 of a full card's worth of value, like a fifth of the card in an exchange got gained for you, for example. Similar to how sometimes when you're playing chess and you exchange pawns, it's better for one player than another. It's not a pawn for pawn exchange. It's a pawn for pawn exchange where you got some additional equity on the board.
Right.
So my requirements were I want my card to care about interacting with the opponents and reward you slightly for it. I said that I really wanted a blue card. Blue is my favorite color in Magic.
I'm surprised.
That one was just like okay, guys, like I want a blue card. I want my card to care about interacting with the opponents. And it has to draw cards, of course.
Naturally.
So those were my requirements for the card. And it took a few different shapes. But over the course of the process, essentially one cool thing that they pitched to me when we were talking about it was like, I'd love it if it was 2 mana. Cheaper cards typically allow a wider range of playability.
Definitely.
One cool thing they suggested was, what if we gave you a star power where the power is equal to the number of cards you've drawn? Because you want to care about how many cards you've drawn. What's a better way of doing that? And I immediately latched onto that idea. I thought it was perfect.
Yep.
There's hopefully not going to be another world championship card with a star power attached to it. And whenever someone sees it, they're like, what is that? So the final design of the card, and I could, answer a few questions about the in-between steps, but it is 1 and a blue, so 2 mana for a star 3 creature. It has flying and vigilance, and whenever I'm trying to think of the exact text on it, but whenever you commit a crime, draw a card and then discard a card. This ability happens once a turn.
And committing a crime to a modern player, of course, makes sense ever since Outlaws of Thunder Junction, I guess, which is a set that it was made in. But to a player of my era, I'm like, what is a crime? Yeah. What does that even mean? Explain what a crime is in the context of Magic in 2024.
So a crime is pretty cool. It means when you target anything of the opponent's, a crime is triggered, essentially. So targeting could be you target them, you target something in their graveyard, a spell or ability on the stack, or a creature that they control. So one of the cool ways that you can utilize this is obviously with a counter spell that counts as committing a crime. If you get to target
it does not.
anything,
I assure you, it's not a crime.
It's a crime, Brian. It's a crime. Sorry. Counter spells are now outlawed.
Outlawed, clearly. It's so interesting to me just to hear that. When I read that, I'm like, okay, crime. What does that mean? Clearly, that means you're like making them discard random cards or something. And it turns out it's just literally targeting anything that they control. Any zone, really, right?
Pretty funny that they've made it so broadly applicable. But the last ability on the card is the power is equal to the number of cards you've drawn, right? So it's self-synergizing where you draw for turn and it's a 1/3 creature. And you target one of their things, you draw, you discard, it's a 2/3.
So good.
And then one of the cool things that I loved about it too is I really like Cube, like we had talked about. I mentioned Cube is one of my favorite formats. So I wanted to be able to pull off combos like you cast Duelist of the Mind on 2, and then you have crazy turns where you either cast Time Twister and get to draw 7, hit for a ton of damage. You get to use a Memory Jar with it, which I've pulled off sometimes. All the draw 7s. Time Spiral into draw more cards. But those are some of my favorite ways to use it.
So nasty, yeah. Remind me the name of it, actually. And I'm curious about how you guys came. Did you come up with the name? Or was that people on the dev team?
So the card's name is Duelist of the Mind. And I don't actually know how we ended up with the final product of that being the name. I think that we kind of talked about some different ideas, but if I'm quite honest, either I suggested or one of the designers did, and we both were like, okay, that's awesome. We're going to go with that. So
Duelist of the
Mind.
Very
collaborative. Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of an impact has it had across different formats?
So it ended up top 8ing Pro Tour Outlaws, actually, I believe, which was super cool. The first Pro Tour that it was legal, it made the top 8.
Yeah, you couldn't ask for better.
And since then, it had moments where it kind of wavered and was not one of the stronger cards in Standard, but it is in, or was in before it was banned, one of the best Standard decks of our current era, which is the VV Cauldron combo deck. Essentially, not to go too in depth about the deck, but VV and Cauldron interacted by giving you tons of mana by exiling VV from the graveyard. And VV says you can basically add blue or red mana equal to a creature's power to your mana pool. I don't know if you've played with VV before.
But I can see the interaction that takes place here, right? As soon as you pump its power up, you get an astronomical amount of mana, and then you do it multiple times. Can you activate VV multiple times in a turn?
So with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, each of your creatures get that ability where they can add mana. And an extra layer. This is so silly how the game engine worked like this, but if you can put 2 VVs under your Soul Cauldron, then you get to activate for each creature 2 different times to make tons and tons of mana. So it really played out like a combo deck. And one cool piece of that deck was, have you played with Proft's Eidetic Memory before?
I don't know that card, no. What does it do?
It's a really cool one. It's 1 and a blue for an enchantment. When it enters, you draw a card, and then at the beginning of combat, put X counters on a creature you control, where X is the number of cards you've drawn this turn, -1. So besides your draw step. And essentially, you had a ton of ways of drawing cards, and then this draw engine that, when you drew cards, you'd put tons of counters on something, and you'd go through your deck, make tons of mana, and then on one turn, you'd have
take
30 or 40 mana and kill them with a duelist or something similar.
Totally. It's interesting. Just as you're describing the cards, I sort of see all the synergies knitting together. What were the payoff cards in that deck to spend the mana on? I expect, because over the time, this is sort of the subject of a longer discussion on the subject of power creep in general, and how power creep has sort of unfolded. I mean, you've been playing the game more than long enough to see the arc of power creep rapidly accelerate. But even by the time when you started to play Magic in the mid 2010s, when you started to take it more seriously, the game had undergone a huge metamorphosis from the era of 20 years prior to that, in terms of where you get value from, the value of an average card and so on. And in terms of what those payoff cards wind up looking like, in the era that I played Magic competitively, the big payoff cards, at least in the mid 1990s, were cards like Brain Geyser, Time Twister, Mind Twist, and so on, Recall to a lesser extent, and in rare cases, X spells and so on. And then over time, there's just been this preponderance of increasingly more powerful payoff cards, X spells that draw cards, X spells that draw cards and deal damage, and so on. Which one did this deck run to spend all the mana on?
So it's really interesting, because a lot of how these decks are configured now for standard and other formats too is your payoffs have to be cheap enough spells that they are good on turn 3, or they're good as your win condition, which is kind of a crazy requirement of how strong the cards are. But the payoff for the cards in this deck were mostly effects like Winter Night Stories, which is draw 3 cards and then discard a creature. And you didn't even need one particular payoff, because your deck had so much inherent synergy that you would go through your deck with just 4 copies of this card draw spell with Flashback for a fraction of the mana cost.
Also, was Flashback built into the card?
Yes.
Is it like compulsive research, or does it cost 4?
So it's draw 3 and then discard 2 unless you discard a creature.
Okay.
Sort of similar in shape. And then you can harmonize from the graveyard, which means, you can tap a creature with X power and reduce its mana cost by that amount. So typically you'd cast it for 3 mana on the front half and 1 mana on the back half.
Wow.
Or if you get to discard it, then you just had a 1 mana draw 3, discard 1.
Sounds like a pretty good engine overall. Yeah, you definitely don't need a payoff card. It also fits the bill that you're talking about. It reminds me, obviously the cards are different, but seeing the decks that were running stock up fairly recently and just being like, oh my God, this card is what on earth?
Disgusting.
I would love your feedback on this series. If you're enjoying the videos, please give me a thumbs up. If there's games you think I might have missed, let me know and I will get to them. See you for the next one.